It was a calm afternoon in Atlanta, Georgia. The sun was shining brightly, and the city seemed to be having a normal day. However, small yellow threads began to appear everywhere. Initially, people didn't give much importance to them. Just common spider webs, they thought. But these webs grew quickly, connecting trees, lampposts, and even parked cars. During the night, the webs glowed eerily under the streetlights, creating an atmosphere of growing unease. When local newspapers began reporting the presence of Joro spiders, a sense of apprehension took over the city. With their enormous webs and the ability to travel long distances using the wind, these spiders multiplied at an alarming rate. Reports from residents encountering giant spiders in their homes and yards started to surface. Local authorities tried to reassure the population, claiming that the spiders were not dangerous to humans. However, photos of palm-sized spiders with bright, colorful bodies quickly spread fear. As the days passed, more and more yellow webs appeared, covering the city in an oppressive shroud. The webs stretched across entire trees, lampposts, and even over parked cars. Spiders were seen hanging in their webs, watching the movement below with their bright and menacing eyes. The climate of fear intensified when the first children began to be bitten, resulting in severe allergic reactions. The news spread rapidly, and sales of insect repellents and protective gear skyrocketed. The situation began to spiral out of control when the spiders started invading public areas. Parks, schools, and even hospitals were covered in webs, making it impossible for people to move freely. The city, which was once a vibrant and lively place, now looked like a war zone. Local authorities were overwhelmed, trying to cope with the growing crisis. The mayor called for an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. But the feeling of helplessness was palpable. The city was on the brink of collapse, and the nightmare had only just begun. In just a few days, Atlanta was transformed. The yellow webs covered houses, buildings, and entire streets. It was an apocalyptic scene. Residents reported encounters with the enormous spiders, which seemed to appear from everywhere. Many began to close doors and windows, trying to protect themselves. But the spiders were persistent, building their webs wherever they found space. Fear spread quickly, and the city's streets became deserted, with few people daring to leave their homes. Local authorities were overwhelmed. Emergency services received thousands of calls from terrified residents. Attempts to control the situation with pesticides failed. The spiders seemed immune to any eradication efforts. The city declared a state of emergency. Schools were closed, public services were interrupted, fear gripped everyone. The national media began covering the calamity, spreading panic even further. Helicopters flew over the city, showing shocking images of the yellow webs covering everything. The federal government sent specialized teams to try to contain the infestation, but each day, the affected area grew. Scientists were baffled by the spiders' rapid reproduction and resistance to traditional control methods. Preliminary studies showed that Joro spiders could quickly adapt to new environments, making it nearly impossible to eliminate them. The spiders began moving to neighboring areas, and adjacent states started reporting sightings, increasing the fear. Meanwhile, everyday life in Atlanta came to a standstill. People began stockpiling food and supplies, fearing the worst. Stores emptied quickly, and prices of basic items soared. The city was in a state of panic, with desperate residents trying to find ways to protect their homes and families. The spiders, on the other hand, continued to multiply and spread their webs everywhere, turning Atlanta into a true ghost town. The siege was complete, and the sense of despair was palpable. The situation quickly spiraled out of control. The yellow webs blocked roads, preventing emergency vehicles from passing. The spiders began to invade hospitals, prisons, and water supply centers. Residents, trapped in their homes, started reporting shortages of basic supplies. The federal government sent specialized teams, but each day the affected area grew. Attempts to contain the infestation with large-scale pesticides failed, as the spiders proved resistant and adaptable. Panic spread to neighboring states. South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Maryland, Oklahoma, and West Virginia reported sightings of Joro spiders. The entire east coast of the United States was under increasing threat. Scientists warned that, if left unchecked, the invasion could spread across the entire country. People began abandoning their homes en masse, resulting in massive traffic jams and accidents. Despair gripped the population. With the infrastructure collapsing, public services began to fail. Hospitals were overwhelmed with patients suffering severe allergic reactions to spider bites. Prisons descended into chaos, with guards struggling to maintain order. Potable water became scarce, and the food supply was disrupted. The streets were deserted, except for the yellow webs fluttering in the wind, a constant reminder of the spider's menacing presence. The economy began to crumble, with markets closing and international trade halted due to fears of spreading the spiders further. Attempts to control the situation with large-scale pesticides failed, as the spiders proved resistant and adaptable. The federal government was powerless in the face of the calamity, and society was on the brink of collapse. The city of Atlanta, once a vibrant hub of activity, was now a battlefield, with its residents desperately fighting for survival. Chaos reigned supreme. The infrastructure began to collapse. Yellow webs blocked entrances to hospitals, prisons, and even water supply centers. With no natural predator to control the spider population, they spread uncontrollably. Fear and disorder led to looting and violence in the streets. The food supply was disrupted, and supermarket shelves were quickly emptied. The local government was overwhelmed and unable to deal with the escalating crisis. Attempts to control the situation with large-scale pesticides failed miserably. The Joro spiders proved resistant and adaptable. With the economy collapsing and public services paralyzed, society was on the brink of complete breakdown. Panic turned to desperation, and the federal government was powerless in the face of the calamity. The sense of disorder was palpable, and the streets were filled with people desperate to find a way to escape the terror. The constant presence of the spiders brought a series of secondary problems. The interruption of public services resulted in blackouts and food shortages. The streets were deserted, except for the yellow webs fluttering in the wind, like flags of an implacable conqueror. The situation worsened when communication systems began to fail, leaving people isolated and unable to call for help. Chaos reigned, and survival of the fittest became the rule. Society was on the brink of total collapse. With no effective means to contain the invasion and resources rapidly dwindling, civilization as it was known began to crumble. Cities were in ruins, overgrown with vegetation and overrun by the eight-legged invaders. The few survivors lived in isolated communities, fearing the day the spiders would expand their domains again. Nature had reclaimed its dominion, and humanity was reduced to fragments of societies struggling to survive. The government declared a state of calamity. Communication lines were cut off. The yellow webs fluttered in the wind, a constant reminder of the spider's relentless presence. International trade halted due to fears of spreading the spiders further. The global economy began to feel the effects of the chaos in the United States. People, in a desperate bid to survive, began forming resistance groups. These groups consisted of local residents, scientists, ex-military personnel, and anyone willing to fight the spider invasion. They armed themselves with improvised equipment, using whatever they could to destroy the webs and repel the spiders. However, the battle was uneven. The spiders were fast, adaptable, and reproduced at an alarming rate. Every attempt to repel the spiders resulted in human casualties and more destruction. Nights were especially terrifying, with the webs glowing in the moonlight and screams of terror echoing through the deserted streets. In the midst of the chaos, some communities managed to create relatively safe areas, where they organized constant vigils and rationed supplies. However, these safe zones were frequently attacked, and often the defenses were not enough to prevent the spider invasions. Stories of brutal attacks and horrific deaths spread quickly, undermining morale and increasing the desperation among survivors. Fear and paranoia spread, and trust within the community began to deteriorate. The complete collapse of society seemed inevitable. Major cities, which were once centers of civilization and progress, were now ruins inhabited by shadows and nightmares. The yellow webs of the spiders covered everything, a grotesque symbol of their dominance. The few survivors struggled to maintain their sanity and hope in a world that had been taken over by a living nightmare. Humanity was on the brink of extinction, and nature seemed determined to reclaim its dominion over what remained of the civilized world. Years passed, and human civilization was never the same again. The Joro spiders dominated vast regions, their webs visible in all directions. Cities lay in ruins, overtaken by vegetation and the eight-legged invaders. The few survivors lived in isolated communities, constantly fearing the day the spiders would expand their territories once more. Nature had reclaimed its dominion, and humanity was reduced to fragments of societies struggling to survive. The most affected areas became forbidden zones, inaccessible and perilous. Vegetation grew unchecked, intertwined with the spiders' webs, creating dark, impenetrable forests. Survivors told tales of ghost cities, where the wind blew through the webs and whispers of the past could be heard. Those who dared to explore these areas rarely returned, and those who did brought back stories of horror and desolation. Isolated communities tried to rebuild a semblance of normal life, but the shadow of the Joro spiders was ever present. Children grew up hearing horror stories about the invasion, and education focused on survival techniques and self-defense. Technology and progress were left behind, replaced by a forced return to a more primitive and dangerous existence. Hope for a better future was scarce, and the daily struggle for survival consumed all the survivors' energy and resources. The invasion of the Joro spiders did not have a happy ending. It served as a grim reminder of the power of nature and the fragility of human society in the face of a biological calamity. The world had changed forever, and horror tales about the yellow webs and the spiders' glowing eyes became legends among the survivors. Humanity, reduced to small, isolated groups, continued to fight against a relentless and seemingly invincible enemy. The age of the spiders had begun, and the future of humanity was uncertain and bleak.